A wild, desperate cry split the dawn as Helen pressed a trembling hand to her heart. Alone on her porch, still haunted by the scars of last winter. Out of the mist, a scruffy bobcat kitten stumbled into her life, fearless and foolish, challenging the silence she'd wrapped around herself since everything changed. Most would have turned away. But Helen took a chance, welcoming chaos, laughter, and a wild friend into her world on the very edge of everything. What began as a rescue unraveled a story bigger than loneliness, a journey through heartbreak, healing, and the courage to set love free. This isn't just about saving a wild animal, it's about saving yourself and a whole community learning to trust the unknown. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country below. And if you believe the bravest thing we can do is open our hearts to wildness, like, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of hope, laughter, and letting go. Sunrise painted the sky in watercolor streaks of pink and tangerine, but Helen Brooks barely noticed. She sat hunched on the porch of her old pine cabin, one hand pressed over her heart. Habit, not necessity, ever since the doctors called her a miracle last winter. Some miracle. She still heard the beeping of machines in her sleep, still woke gasping at the memory of hands pounding on her chest. Today, though, the air was sharp and clean, and her lungs filled with it like a second chance. The pines whispered overhead. All around her, the world seemed poised on the edge of something she couldn't name. Helen sipped coffee from a chipped mug, watching the mist crawl across her meadow. In the hush before the world woke up, she tried to believe she was truly alone out here. Then, an ear-splitting yowl shattered the quiet. Helen startled, nearly dropping her mug. The cry came again, raw and desperate, somewhere in the tangled brush just beyond her porch steps. She tensed, scanning the thicket. Coyotes? Raccoons? The woods were full of surprises. After her heart attack, she'd learned to be wary of surprises. A small shadow darted between the ferns, then paused, shaking. Helen's first thought was Kitten, but this creature was no house cat. It was wild, scruffy, spindly-legged, its ears too big for its tiny head. It stumbled out into the open, paws splayed, as if it had never tried walking before. Its coat was a dusty swirl of cinnamon and cream, tufted at the cheeks. And its eyes, huge, wary, and gold, fixed on Helen with a look halfway between terror and challenge. The little bobcat kitten crept closer, then let out another yowl, startling itself backward and nearly tumbling into a pair of Helen's rubber rain boots sitting by the door. For a heartbeat, human and wild cat stared at each other. The kitten arched its back, hissed, a ridiculous, almost comical sound, more squeak than threat. Helen couldn't help it. She laughed, a sharp, unguarded sound that startled even herself. "Well," she murmured, voice rough from disuse, "you're a brave little fool, aren't you?" The kitten stared, whiskers quivering. It didn't run. Instead, it gave her boots a suspicious sniff, then sat on its haunches with the stubborn dignity only wild things possess. For a long moment, they simply existed together, breath frosting in the morning chill. Helen's heart thudded, too hard, too fast, and she placed her hand over it, grounding herself. She thought of all the things she'd lost since her retirement. Purpose, routine, the company of friends who drifted away when she grew sick. She'd come out here to heal, but the silence had settled around her like a shroud. "Why are you here?" she whispered. "Aren't you supposed to be out there? Wild? Free?" She almost laughed at herself. What was she, if not something broken, pushed to the edge of her world? The kitten flicked its ear, then, with a sudden spasm of courage, crept closer to the porch step. It sniffed at a patch of dew on the wood, then let out a soft, questioning chirp. Helen wondered if it was hungry, lost, or just as alone as she felt. She considered reaching for her phone. Animal control would have advice, but something in those wild golden eyes held her back. For now, she let the moment stretch, uncertain and full of possibility. A breeze rattled the wind chimes by her door. The kitten flinched, then darted behind the boots, peeking out with comical suspicion. Helen chuckled again, softer this time. She realized with a pang how long it had been since she'd really laughed. Not polite laughter, but the wild, startled kind that rises up and shakes the dust off your soul. The question lingered, heavy as the dawn fog. Why had this wild, living thing crossed her path? Was it a sign? A challenge, maybe? Or just another lonely wanderer, searching for something it couldn't name? Helen leaned forward, studying the kitten, and in that moment, something fragile and essential passed between them. As the sun rose higher, the kitten gathered itself with exaggerated caution and tiptoed off the porch, vanishing into the brush. Helen watched it go, heart oddly light. The silence returned, but it felt different, charged, like a story just beginning. She wrapped her cardigan tighter and went inside to refill her mug, her mind full of questions she hadn't dared ask in months. What did this wild creature want from her? What was she missing in her own carefully guarded life? And could a heart stitched together by doctors ever be wild or brave again? Outside, just beyond the porch, a pair of golden eyes lingered in the shadow. The edge of everything was closer than Helen thought. The rain came down hard the next afternoon, battering the cabin roof until it sounded like 1,000 tiny drums. Helen stood at her kitchen window, staring into the gray wall outside, arms wrapped tight around her chest. Even with a fire crackling, the damp seemed to soak through her skin. There was no sign of the kitten since yesterday's strange meeting. She'd told herself not to worry. Wild things belonged to the wild, but a quiet, unshakable sense of responsibility had settled in her bones. She tried to focus on small tasks, folding blankets, sorting tea tins, checking the old radio for storm warnings. Every few minutes, she found herself peering out at the trembling branches, straining for any hint of movement. Maggie, her aging golden retriever, was restless too, padding from room to room with anxious eyes, nose pressed to the floor as if tracking invisible footsteps. When the storm reached its peak, the power flickered and went out. Helen lit a lantern and sat down, heart skipping with every distant crack of thunder. She had just begun to doze in her chair when a faint, broken sound broke through the storm, something between a cry and a whimper, barely audible above the rain. She froze, listening hard. There it was again, a tiny, desperate mewling, much closer than before. Without thinking, Helen pulled on her boots, grabbed a flashlight, and pushed open the door. Rain pelted her face as she stepped into the swirling dark. Maggie pressed at her side, ears pricked. The sound led her around the side of the porch, where the overhang shielded a patch of dirt and leaves from the worst of the rain. There, huddled and soaked to the bone, was the little Bobcat kitten. Finn, she realized suddenly, the name popping into her mind as if it had always belonged to him. He looked terrible. His fur was plastered to his skinny body, and a thin streak of blood traced down one hind leg. He tried to rise as she approached, but his paw slipped and he slumped back, shivering. He let out a pathetic snarl, batting at her with a feeble paw, but Helen saw the fear and pain behind the bluster. Her nurse's instincts kicked in, fierce and clear. "It's okay," she murmured, lowering herself carefully. Maggie whined, but stayed back. Helen inched closer, hands trembling not just from the cold, until she could see the wound. A ragged slice above Finn's ankle, likely from some sharp wire or broken branch. "It's all right. I've got you now." Her voice was gentle, steadying herself as much as him. Slowly, so he could see every movement, she scooped him up in the flannel blanket she'd brought. He squirmed, hissing, claws catching on the fabric, but exhaustion finally won, and he went limp in her arms. Inside, she laid Finn on a towel beside the fireplace, quickly fetching her old first aid kit. Rainwater pooled beneath him, and his tiny sides heaved with shallow, frightened breaths. Helen's hands shook as she cleaned the wound with warm water, dabbing blood away with cotton balls. Finn lashed out once, half-conscious, his paw striking a stray ball of yarn that rolled across the floor. The scene was absurd, deadly serious and faintly ridiculous, as he batted at the yarn with a faint growl, determined to prove he was still wild even as he could barely lift his head. Helen talked to him in a steady stream, about nothing and everything. "You remind me of someone I knew, stubborn and scrappy. That was me after my surgery. Didn't want anyone fussing either." The rhythm of her voice seemed to calm him. Maggie, after a wary sniff, settled a careful distance away, head on her paws, watching Finn with solemn eyes. She finished cleaning the wound, wrapped it gently, and set out a dish of water and a little leftover chicken. Finn blinked at her, confused, then lapped up the water, his tongue flicking so quickly it made Helen smile. When he was finished, he curled up, still wary but too tired to protest, eyes closing in the flicker of firelight. Helen sat back, exhaustion sweeping through her. The room was silent, but for the rain and Finn's soft, uneven breathing. She realized her hands were still trembling, not with fear this time, but with something like hope, a sense of responsibility, no, of purpose, filled the space where loneliness used to live. She knew she was taking a risk. Her own health was still fragile, and wild animals were unpredictable. But looking at Finn, so small and broken, she made a silent promise. She would give this little soul a fighting chance, no matter what it cost her. Night deepened. Finn dreamed fitfully, legs twitching, a tiny growl rumbling in his chest. Helen stayed close, sipping tea, watching the storm move off into the hills. She couldn't say what tomorrow would bring. Trouble, joy, heartbreak, maybe all three. For now, she only knew that she and Finn, each battered and brave in their own way, had found each other on the edge of everything. And for the first time in a long while, Helen let herself hope that this second chance was real. For both of them. The storm passed, leaving a hush over the pines so deep that Helen could hear the quiet drip of water from every needle and bough. The morning felt washed clean. Sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, casting thin, golden bars across the porch and the rough wooden floorboards inside the cabin. Helen moved slowly, feeling the ache in her shoulders, but a quiet determination shaped every step. Finn, the little bobcat, was still curled on the towel beside the fireplace, breathing in small, steady puffs. His wound looked clean, the bleeding had stopped, and the bandage, though awkward on his leg, hadn't been chewed off in the night. Helen let out a long breath, more relief than she'd expected. Maggie, the golden retriever, watched Finn with big, patient eyes, her tail thumping once or twice whenever he shifted or let out a kittenish grunt. Helen set a dish of water and a little shredded chicken near Finn's nose. He opened one golden eye, sniffed suspiciously, and then, as if remembering hunger, devoured every bite. When he finished, he licked his paw and gave Helen a baleful look that was somehow both wild and grateful. As the cabin warmed, the ordinary rhythms of life slowly returned. Helen lit the wood stove, filling the rooms with the sweet scent of pine sap and old paper. Outside, the trees shivered off their rain, and a few chickadees appeared, hopping from branch to branch. Helen sipped coffee, feeling the silence differently now, less empty, more alive. She spent the day moving quietly between chores, always glancing back to the hearth where Finn slept or watched her with that bright, watchful gaze. Once, she caught herself humming an old tune as she swept the floor, a tune she hadn't thought of in years. The music made Finn lift his head, ears twitching, as if he were listening for some hidden meaning. Maggie seemed content to play the role of gentle guardian. When Finn limped across the rug, Maggie would stretch and roll, blocking his path until he batted her tail. The big dog would then thump her tail harder, eyes shining with a kind of patient amusement. Sometimes, Finn would creep up, touch his nose to Maggie's fur, and dart away as if startled by his own boldness. In the afternoons, the rain returned. Not a storm this time, just a slow, steady drizzle. Helen stoked the fire, made herself tea, and pulled up a battered old armchair near the window. Finn jumped onto the windowsill, his bandaged legs sticking out awkwardly, and watched the raindrops race each other down the glass. Helen found herself talking, quietly, as she'd done in the hospital after her heart attack. It's strange, isn't it? How life slows down after something big happens. You think the world's going to rush on ahead without you. But then you wake up, and everything feels different. Slower, softer, maybe even kinder. Finn flicked his ear, as if in agreement, and pressed his nose to the cool window pane. She told Finn about her daughter, who lived 2 states away and called only on holidays. She talked about her old job at the clinic, how much she missed the feeling of helping people, of being needed. You know, when you get old and sick, everyone treats you like you're made of glass, but you still feel all the sharp edges inside. Finn gazed at her, silent but attentive, his wild gold eyes unblinking. Maggie let out a deep sigh and stretched her muzzle onto Helen's slippered foot, warmth radiating up through Helen's ankle. The silence between them began to feel less like loneliness and more like a gentle, necessary pause. When dusk fell, Helen moved around the small kitchen, putting on a pot of soup. Finn trailed her with surprising curiosity, nose twitching, tail flicking at every new scent. He even attempted to paw at the soup ladle, only to tumble off the counter with a disgruntled squeak. Maggie trotted over, sniffed him all over, and then licked his ear, as if to say, "Welcome to the pack." Later, with the fire burning low and the world outside wrapped in mist, Helen settled into her armchair. Finn curled on the back of the couch, head tucked under his good paw, tail flicking in dreams. Maggie snored softly, sprawled out on the rug. Helen listened to their breathing, the 3 of them, alone together at the edge of the world. A deep peace settled over Helen, something she hadn't felt since before her heart failed. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about what might go wrong, or how close she'd come to dying. She was here now, in a warm circle of firelight and trust, with 2 odd creatures, one wild, one loyal, who needed her just as much as she needed them. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside the cabin, the slow, gentle rhythm of healing had begun. The first true sunshine in a week spilled golden light through the cabin's windows, painting stripes on the worn wooden floor and turning dust motes into drifting, silent dancers. Helen woke early, as usual, listening to the soft snoring of Maggie on the rug and the tentative, almost imperceptible patter of tiny paws exploring the corners of her home. Finn had found his legs again, awkwardly at first, but each day growing stronger, braver, more curious. He moved through the cabin like a fuzzy shadow, silent as breath, but always with a glint of mischief in his wild golden eyes. At breakfast, Helen discovered her slippers had gone missing. She found them later under the kitchen table, one stuffed with a pine cone, the other with a half-eaten sock. When she bent to retrieve them, Finn leaped from behind the chair, pouncing on her hand, claws sheathed but intent clear. He wanted to play. "You little bandit," Helen said, half laughing, half scolding. Finn responded with a dramatic arch of his back, fur puffed and tail flicking, and darted away, only to pause behind Maggie, as if daring Helen to come after him. Maggie, ever patient, lifted her big head and thumped her tail, seemingly amused by the chaos unfolding around her. After breakfast, Helen set a bowl of water out on the porch and opened the screen door. Finn crept out, nose twitching, wary at first, but quickly distracted by a moth fluttering in a beam of sunlight. He pounced, missed, tumbled, and landed in a heap, only to spring up again and try to catch his own tail. Helen watched, leaning against the doorframe, laughter bubbling up from a place inside her that had long been silent. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this feeling. The kind of laughter that shook loose the dust in her chest, made her feel alive instead of just surviving. Finn darted back inside, zigzagging between Helen's legs and making a beeline for Maggie's tail. The golden retriever lifted her tail lazily, then dropped it with a heavy sigh as Finn pounced, clung for dear life, and rode it like a rodeo cowboy. Maggie didn't even bother to get up, but her tail thudded rhythmically, each thump accompanied by Finn's delighted squeak. Throughout the day, the mischief continued. Helen found her reading glasses dangling from a lampshade, a half-finished puzzle scattered to the four corners of the living room, and a small stash of wildflowers on her pillow. Finn, meanwhile, became increasingly bold, exploring every nook and cranny of the cabin. At one point, he caught sight of his own reflection in the glass door, and after a long stare-down, launched himself at the intruder, only to bounce off with a look of utter betrayal that had Helen clutching her sides with laughter. There were still moments of stillness, long, soft afternoons where Finn curled on the back of the sofa, Maggie sprawled at Helen's feet, and the only sounds were the whisper of wind in the pines and the gentle crackle of the fire. Helen took to reading aloud, sometimes poetry, sometimes the old letters she kept in a wooden box. Finn listened, head cocked, his eyes half closed in the sunlight, as if he understood every word. One afternoon, as Helen folded laundry, Finn snuck up behind her, darting out from beneath a pile of shirts with a wild yowl. She jumped, startled, and then, unable to help herself, threw a balled-up sock at him. He leaped, caught it in midair, and tumbled backward into Maggie's side. The big dog barely stirred, used to his antics by now, and merely shifted to make room for her wild companion. The days developed a gentle rhythm, Helen tending to the fire, the meals, and her own slow healing. Finn playing, exploring, resting, and watching her with that wild, curious gaze. Maggie bringing quiet warmth and steady companionship. Their little family found a balance, not in words, but in small, shared moments. A look, a touch. The soft sigh of trust as Finn curled beside Helen's feet at night. Sometimes, Helen caught herself staring at Finn, wondering what had brought him to her door, why he'd chosen to stay. She saw in him the wildness she feared she'd lost, the spark that made each day unpredictable and full of potential. In caring for him, she was reminded that she too was capable of change, of laughter, of opening her heart again. One evening, as the sky burned orange and violet beyond the pines, Helen sat on the porch steps, Finn beside her and Maggie stretched out at her feet. The world was quiet except for the chorus of crickets and the distant rush of wind. Finn pressed his small, warm body against her side, and Helen placed her hand gently on his back. For a moment, everything felt perfect, wild, untamed, and completely at peace. It wasn't words that bound them, but the shared rhythm of living, each day a little brighter, a little wilder, a little more full of laughter. Helen knew that, whatever else the future held, she was no longer alone at the edge of the world. The days turned warmer and longer, and with each sunrise Finn seemed to shed a bit more of his uncertainty, blossoming into pure, wild joy. The meadows at the edge of Helen's property unfurled into a sea of grasses and wildflowers, bees buzzing low in the clover, butterflies flickering like bits of colored paper. Helen watched as Finn became more than just a guest. He was now an unpredictable force of nature, and the whole countryside was about to notice. It started innocently enough. On a bright morning, Helen opened her door to the sound of laughter from the road. Two hikers, gear slung over their shoulders, were stopped in the lane, staring at the spectacle in Helen's front yard. Finn, tail high and tufted ears twitching, was crouched low in the grass, eyes fixed on the hiker's bootlaces. He sprang, perfect pounce, landing on one man's boot, paws batting at the laces with kittenish fury. The startled hiker stumbled, laughing, while his friend snapped photos. Finn, undaunted, tumbled away, rolling in the dew-soaked grass and shooting Helen a look that dared her to scold him. Helen waved sheepishly, apologizing for her resident wildcat, but the hikers only grinned, promising to share their photos online and asking if Finn was some kind of trained animal. "He's not trained," Helen replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "He's just himself." Word spread, as it does in small communities. Within days, neighbors began to drop by Helen's gate, not to visit her exactly, but hoping for a glimpse of the legendary, funny wildcat. Some arrived with children in tow, others with cameras and phones at the ready. One afternoon, Helen returned from the store to find Finn lounging on top of her mailbox, tail dangling, as the local mailman stood frozen on the gravel path, an amused but nervous smile on his face. "Guess you've got a new postmaster, Helen," the mailman called, gingerly depositing a stack of envelopes in Finn's vicinity. Finn batted a postcard to the ground, then leapt down and disappeared under the porch. Helen laughed until her sides hurt, waving an apology that the mailman waved off with good humor. Not all the reactions were positive. Some neighbors frowned at the idea of a bobcat so close to homes and gardens. One morning, Helen found a polite but firmly worded note tucked in her mailbox. "Wild animals belong in the wild. Please be careful. A concerned neighbor." Helen read it twice, feeling her stomach tighten. She understood the worry. Finn was a bobcat after all, and no matter how sweet or funny, he was still wild. That evening, Finn came home with a dusting of flour on his paws and a sly look in his eyes. Helen could only imagine what mischief he'd gotten into. Perhaps a neighbor's kitchen window left cracked, or a chicken coop too tempting to ignore. She scrubbed his paws, scolding gently, but inside she was torn between pride and apprehension. Maggie sat by, wagging her tail, as if to say, "He's one of us now, whatever anyone thinks." One Saturday, Helen heard laughter and voices from the edge of her meadow. She went out and found 3 children, eyes wide, watching Finn stalk butterflies and pounce at grasshoppers in the sun. Their mother, who lived 2 houses down, called out an apology, but Helen waved it away, inviting them closer. For half an hour, the group sat in the grass, marveling at Finn's antics. Helen answered questions, shared stories about his rescue, and listened to the children giggle as Finn crept up, sniffed a shoelace, then darted off into the brush. That night, for the first time in years, Helen joined the neighbors for coffee at the corner store. The talk was lively, mostly about Finn, but also about gardens, the best bakery in town, and local wildlife sightings. Helen found herself laughing, sharing stories, her heart lighter than it had been since before her illness. It struck her that Finn's wildness was bringing people together, breaking down old walls. Even those who grumbled about him seemed a little less closed off when the conversation turned to his pranks. Still, the tension was real. Some neighbors insisted Helen was being reckless, tempting fate by letting a bobcat live so close. Rumors swirled. Finn had been seen in the vegetable patch, the chicken run, even perched on a garden gnome in the Smith's yard. Helen took the concerns seriously. She bought more fencing, kept a closer eye on Finn, and talked to Maggie as if the dog might have some wisdom to offer. "I'm doing my best," she confided one evening, stroking Finn's ears as he purred, surprisingly loud for a wildcat. "But you're not meant to be tamed, are you?" Finn blinked up at her, utterly unrepentant, and Helen couldn't help but smile. The summer evenings grew long and golden. Helen, Maggie, and Finn often sat on the porch together, watching the fireflies blink on and the shadows lengthen in the meadow. Sometimes, neighbors would pass on the road, calling out good-natured warnings or laughing greetings. Finn's mischief, for all its trouble, had brought laughter and light back into Helen's life, and in some ways, into the heart of the whole community. But as the days slipped by, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. Finn's wildness, once a source of delight, was beginning to draw the wrong kind of attention. For now, though, she let herself savor every wild, ridiculous moment, holding close the knowledge that nothing gold ever stays, and that sometimes the greatest joy comes from letting a little chaos into your life. The summer air thickened with the scent of cut grass and distant rain. By now, Finn was the talk of the whole valley, a legend with a dozen stories swirling around him, some true, some wildly embroidered by the folks who'd glimpsed his antics. Helen found herself drawn out of her shell more and more, talking to neighbors on her porch, chatting in the aisles of the grocery store, always answering the same questions. Is he safe? Has he ever hurt anyone? Will you keep him forever? But Helen's heart knew what her mouth rarely admitted. Finn was a wild thing, and the world had a way of reminding you, sometimes brutally, that wildness doesn't always fit neatly into the spaces you make for it. It happened on a late evening when the sky was deep blue and thunder grumbled in the distance. Helen was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough, when Maggie barked, a sharp, worried sound that she'd learned to trust. She hurried to the door just as Finn came limping up the porch steps, his body low to the ground, fur matted and eyes glazed with pain. Blood streaked one of his hind legs. Helen's breath caught. "Oh, Finn!" She dropped the towel she'd been holding and knelt. Finn let out a low, angry growl, but there was no real heat in it. Just fear, exhaustion, and hurt. Maggie hovered, whimpering softly, clearly wanting to help but unsure how. Helen's hands shook as she guided Finn into the living room, setting him gently on an old quilt. She fetched her first aid kit, the same one she'd used the night Finn first appeared in the storm. As she cut away a tangle of fur, she found the wound, an ugly tear, fresh and deep, crusted with dirt and a broken piece of barbed wire still tangled in the fur. "Oh, honey, what were you chasing out there?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and guilt. Had she been too careless? Should she have kept him inside more, fenced off the property better? But Finn's wildness was the heart of him. How could she have caged that? She set about cleaning the wound, speaking softly as she worked. "You know, I used to think I could fix everything if I just tried hard enough. That's what nurses do, right? But life's not always something you can fix." Finn flinched but let her work, pressing his head against her wrist as if to anchor himself. Maggie, usually so boisterous, lay down close, stretching her long body protectively along Finn's side. The two animals shared a quiet understanding, the old retriever's warmth easing some of Finn's shivers. Helen dressed the wound, wrapped it gently, and set out a bowl of water and a handful of treats. Finn ignored the food, but lapped at the water, breathing in harsh, shaky bursts. Helen sat beside him until the shaking slowed, until his eyes drifted closed. Only then did she realize her own heart was racing. Her hands cramped from tension. The night grew long and heavy, rain pattering softly on the windows. Helen made tea but barely touched it, her mind spinning. This was the second time Finn had limped home broken. She worried for him, worried too for herself. Was she doing the right thing, keeping him here? Was she putting him at risk, or herself, or the neighborhood she was just starting to feel a part of again? The next day dawned gray and humid. Finn slept, twitching and whimpering in dreams, while Maggie kept close watch. Helen did her chores as quietly as possible, her mind never far from the injured Bobcat. Late that morning, a white truck pulled into the drive, official lettering on the door, Animal Control. Helen's heart plummeted. A tall man and a woman in uniform stepped out, clipboards in hand. Maggie barked, low and uncertain. Helen met them on the porch, nerves prickling. Is this about Finn? The woman smiled, but her eyes were wary. We've had some calls. People are concerned about a wildcat living so close to town. We're just here to make sure everything's safe. For you, your neighbors, and the animal. Helen felt herself bristle, wanting to protect Finn, to explain how gentle and funny he was, how much joy he'd brought not just to her, but to so many. Instead, she took a slow breath and nodded. He's hurt right now, caught on a fence. I've been taking care of him. He's never hurt anyone, I promise. The man took notes, glancing at the scratch marks on the porch posts, at the cluster of wildflowers and bones Finn had collected in the yard. He's not a pet, ma'am. He might not always mean harm, but wild is wild. You have to be careful, for everyone's sake. Helen swallowed hard. The woman's tone softened. We don't want to take him, not if we don't have to. But you need to promise, when he's healed, you'll help him get back to the wild where he belongs. It's best for everyone. It's best for him. Helen looked past them, to where Finn slept. Maggie curled beside him, sunlight dappling their fur. Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to beg for more time, but she saw the truth in their eyes and heard it in her own heart. Finn wasn't meant for this porch forever. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I promise. When he's strong again, I'll let him go." The officers left with a few more warnings and a handful of brochures about local wildlife. Helen closed the door behind them, feeling the weight of their words settle onto her shoulders. She sat with Finn and Maggie as the afternoon drifted by, stroking Finn's back, whispering a promise she knew would break her heart. Later, as dusk fell, Finn stirred and lifted his head, blinking at Helen. She smiled through her tears. "You're going to be all right, wild boy. I'll make sure of it. Even if it means saying goodbye." In that moment, surrounded by the gentle breath of two animals she loved, Helen understood what true love was, caring enough to let go. The summer waned and the air thinned out, sharp with pine sap and the distant promise of fall. Days passed in a kind of golden, bittersweet haze. Finn's wound healed slowly but surely under Helen's watchful care. Each bandage change a gentle ritual, each day a gift borrowed from the wild. Helen found herself savoring every detail: the small weight of Finn's body against her side at night, the bright flare of his eyes as he watched chipmunks scatter across the porch, the way Maggie pressed herself protectively between them whenever she sensed Helen's sadness. But the memory of Animal Control's visit lingered in the corners of the cabin. Helen couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest, the sense that her little world was about to shift in ways she couldn't control. The officer's words echoed in her mind. "You need to promise. When he's healed, you'll help him get back to the wild where he belongs." She'd made the promise, but her heart ached every time she looked at Finn. The Bobcat was thriving now, his coat thick and glossy, his limp nearly gone. With every passing day, he became more himself, bolder, quicker, more restless. He paced the window ledges, nose pressed to the glass, tail flicking as if he could smell freedom on the breeze. Helen knew, deep down, that she couldn't keep him here, not if she truly loved him. Yet the thought of letting him go felt unbearable, as if she were being asked to cut away a piece of her own heart. She busied herself with chores, taking long, slow walks through the meadow with Maggie at her side and Finn trailing behind, silent as a shadow. She told herself she was just enjoying their last days together. But in truth, she was stalling for time. One afternoon, Helen set out a basket of laundry to dry in the sun. Finn followed her outside, stretching in the grass, rolling in the sweet clover, then darting off to chase a grasshopper. Maggie flopped in the shade, tongue lolling, her eyes half closed. The world felt peaceful, almost suspended in time. Helen watched Finn run, wild and strong, and for the first time she saw him not as a rescued kitten, but as the creature he truly was, untamed, fierce, beautiful. The thought struck her with unexpected clarity. He doesn't belong to me. He never did. That evening, Helen sat on the porch with Finn curled beside her and Maggie sprawled at their feet. The sun dipped low, casting long blue shadows across the yard. Helen stroked Finn's head, her fingers threading through his soft fur. "You know, buddy, I think you're ready," she whispered. Finn blinked up at her, untroubled, content in the warmth of her hand. She spent the next few days preparing herself and Finn for what would come. She left the door open during the day, letting him come and go as he pleased. At first, Finn stuck close, circling the cabin, returning for meals and naps. But each day, his explorations took him further, into the meadow, down the pine trail, toward the shadowy edge of the woods. Helen watched him go with her heart in her throat, waiting, hoping, always relieved when he returned. Each night he stayed a little longer outside, Each morning he was a little wilder, a little less a part of her world. During those last days, Helen made the most of every moment. She rose with the sun to watch Finn chase moths in the golden light, cooked hearty breakfasts for herself and Maggie, and even found herself humming again. Old folk songs, half remembered, the kind her mother used to sing when Helen was small. Sometimes she'd find Finn sitting at the edge of the porch, listening with tilted ears, his wild heart strangely in tune with her own. The community, too, seemed to sense the change. Neighbors dropped by with well wishes, baked goods, and bittersweet stories about wild animals they'd known. The mailman, who had once been wary, now looked for Finn each morning, leaving little treats on the mailbox. Children left hand-drawn pictures of bobcats tucked into Helen's screen door. Laughter and kindness had returned to Helen's life, weaving a net of connection she hadn't known she needed. On the last morning, Helen woke before dawn. The sky was a deep indigo, the trees black silhouettes against the faint light. She brewed coffee, fed Maggie, and sat in silence, waiting for Finn to return from his nightly wanderings. When he finally appeared, silent as mist, eyes bright and alert, Helen knew the moment had come. She opened the door wide. Finn stepped out onto the porch, tail high, then paused at the edge of the steps. He turned to look at Helen, his gaze long and lingering, something almost human in the quiet understanding between them. Helen knelt, tears stinging her eyes. "Go on, wild boy. This is your world now." Finn hesitated, then padded down the steps, across the dew-wet grass, and into the line of trees at the edge of the property. He stopped once, glancing back, eyes shining in the early light. Then, with a flick of his tail, disappeared into the pines. Helen watched him go, her heart breaking and swelling at the same time. Maggie pressed against her side, steady and warm. The sun broke over the trees, gilding the cabin and the meadow in gold. The world felt empty and full all at once. Helen sat there for a long time, letting the ache and gratitude mingle inside her, knowing she'd done the hardest, kindest thing a person can do. She'd given Finn back to himself. She'd let him go. And in the hush of the morning, as the wild laughter of the pines rose all around her, Helen understood. Letting go was a kind of love, too. The cabin felt impossibly quiet in the days after Finn disappeared into the pines. Helen moved through the rooms on muscle memory, opening curtains, brewing coffee, straightening the faded quilt on the sofa where Finn used to nap. But everything seemed to echo a little now, as if the walls themselves missed the wild pulse of energy that had filled them for so many months. Even Maggie seemed subdued, spending her afternoons stretched out on the porch, her nose pressed to the air, ears flicking whenever a twig snapped or a bird called in the brush. For the first time since her heart attack, Helen wasn't sure how to fill her days. She kept busy, as she always had, tending to her garden, writing letters to her daughter, reading mystery novels by the fire. But the house felt emptier, every quiet moment reminding her of what she'd lost. The ache of missing Finn was a real thing, a raw, sweet pain that throbbed beneath the surface of her daily routine. And yet, there was something else growing beneath the ache, a strange, unexpected richness, as if letting go had opened up new space inside her for wonder, for gratitude, for possibility. It started with the smallest things. One morning, Helen stepped out onto the porch and found a muddy paw print on the top step, perfectly formed in the drying dew. It was too large and rounded to be a house cat's, too delicate to belong to Maggie. Helen knelt and traced the print with her finger, a smile tugging at her lips. Finn had been back, or at least passed close enough to leave a mark. The print was a gift, proof that he was out there, alive and wild, still tethered to her in some invisible way. After that, she started noticing other signs. A feather left on the windowsill, blue jay, iridescent, almost certainly placed with purpose. A tiny pile of acorns on her doormat. One morning, a half-eaten apple, teeth marks unmistakable, left beside her gardening gloves. Each offering felt like a secret message, a playful nod from the world beyond her fence. Helen talked to Finn sometimes, out loud, as she watered her tomatoes or mended the porch rail. "I see you, wild boy," she'd say, laughing quietly, still keeping me on my toes. It became a daily ritual, stepping outside, scanning the yard for some new trace of his presence. She never caught more than a fleeting glimpse, the flash of a tawny tail disappearing into the bracken, the glint of golden eyes in the dusk, a rustle in the high grass that might have been the wind or something more. The community, too, felt the echo of Finn's wild laughter. The mailman still left treats on the mailbox, and now neighbors stopped to ask if Helen had seen her Bobcat lately. The children who'd once come to watch Finn play began to leave little gifts, drawings of wildcats, flowers pressed between sheets of wax paper, even a storybook about brave animals that one girl said reminded her of Finn. People seemed softer, more open. They asked after Helen's health, offered rides to town, brought her extra eggs or garden vegetables. The fear that had once followed Finn's mischief had been replaced by a kind of wonder and kindness that radiated through the neighborhood. Helen realized that Finn had given her more than company. He had given her back her place in the world. She was no longer just the quiet widow on the edge of the pines, but someone woven into the stories and memories of her neighbors. Her home, once so isolated, now felt like part of something larger, a community knit together by laughter, curiosity, and care. But the truest change was inside herself. In the quiet hours of the morning, Helen reflected on how much she had changed since Finn first tumbled onto her porch. Back then, she had been closed off, afraid of her health, of loneliness, of the unknown. Finn had brought chaos and joy and the challenge of opening her heart again. But it was in his leaving that Helen discovered what she was truly made of. She found herself savoring uncertainty, the way each day was full of possibility, the way the woods beyond her yard seemed wider and more alive now. She began to take long walks with Maggie, letting the dog lead her down winding trails she'd never bothered to explore before. Each step was a small act of trust, a promise to herself that she wouldn't shrink from life's wildness anymore. Sometimes, when she sat on the porch at dusk, Helen thought about what it meant to care for something wild. It wasn't about taming or possessing. It was about respect and trust, and the courage to let go when the time was right. Finn had taught her that love was risky, and that it was always worth the risk. On one especially bright morning, Helen woke to find a streak of sunlight across her pillow and the faintest scratch at the kitchen door. She moved quietly, heart pounding, and peeked outside. There in the yard, just at the edge of the woods, stood Finn, grown now, sleek and strong, his golden eyes fixed on hers. For a long moment, they looked at each other, a silent greeting passing between them. Then, just as quickly, Finn turned and vanished into the green. Helen smiled, tears blurring her vision, feeling both loss and joy blooming together in her chest. Her life was quieter now, but it was also deeper, richer. A life marked by wild encounters, laughter, and the knowledge that she could survive uncertainty, could love without guarantees, could let go and still be whole. And as the days grew long and sweet, Helen knew that she would always carry Finn with her, not as a possession, but as a lesson, a memory, and a wild friend who had taught her how to open her heart again. The seasons turned, painting the pines in gold and rust, then shrouding the valley in the icy blue of winter. Time slowed in the woods, the days growing short and the nights long and silent. Helen moved through the rhythms of her life, each moment marked by the quiet presence of absence, yet her heart was fuller than it had ever been. Some mornings she woke to find fresh paw prints in the snow near the porch, trailing toward the forest's edge. Sometimes she caught a glimpse of Finn's silhouette against the white, standing watchful at the tree line, his fur fluffed against the cold. These moments were fleeting, but they carried the weight of 1,000 words. In their silence was a comfort deeper than any spoken promise. Finn was still out there, wild and whole, and so was she. One crisp afternoon, as Helen sat wrapped in a blanket, Maggie pressed warm against her hip. She stared out at the shimmering snow and let her thoughts drift. She found herself reflecting on the strange and beautiful journey that had brought her to this quiet place, on the edge of everything. Her mind wandered back to the first time she saw Finn, small and scrappy, all sharp edges and defiant wildness. How frightened she'd been, of the world, of her own fragility, of letting anyone or anything matter too much again. She remembered the nights spent nursing Finn through injury, the laughter and the chaos he brought into her ordered life, the way her heart had slowly thawed and grown bold again in the fire of his presence. She thought of the people who had come into her orbit because of Finn, the neighbors, the children, the mailmen, the strangers who became friends. One wild creature had changed everything, just by being himself. Helen realized now that what she'd shared with Finn was something more than mere companionship. It was a rare and unspoken trust, the willingness to risk heartbreak for the chance to experience real connection, to offer care without expectation, to love without holding on too tightly. She had learned that true friendship wasn't about possession or protection, but about respect, acceptance, and letting go. As she sat there, Maggie breathing softly at her side, Helen found herself considering the nature of freedom. Finn had needed her in his weakest moments, but he had never been hers to keep. She had been a sanctuary, a place of safety and healing, but the wildness in him could not, and should not, be contained. Letting him go had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but it was also the purest act of love she'd ever offered. She realized she'd been set free, too. For so long, she'd lived with the fear of loss, of health, of purpose, of meaning. She'd closed herself off, believing that safety meant isolation. But Finn had shattered that illusion. He'd reminded her that life's greatest joys are found in its wildness, its unpredictability, and its willingness to change. In giving Finn his freedom, Helen had reclaimed her own. Neighbors often asked her, "Don't you miss him?" She would smile, feeling that bittersweet ache in her chest, and say, "Of course I do. But missing him means I got to know him in the first place, and that's something I'll never regret." She began to see that her time with Finn was never meant to last forever. It was meant to change her. Her story with Finn rippled through the community, a quiet lesson that spread wider than she ever imagined. Neighbors who once feared the wild now left food out for the animals that passed by. Children learned to watch for paw prints and listen for distant, wild laughter in the trees. People grew kinder, more patient, with each other and with the world beyond their fences. Even Maggie, once a solitary soul herself, seemed to walk with a new gentleness. as if she too understood what it meant to be part of something bigger and braver than herself. Sometimes Helen sat by the fire, pen in hand, and tried to capture all she'd learned. She wrote in her journal, "True friendship is wild. It asks us to open our hearts to change and to let go when it's time. It means loving enough to risk the ache of loss." Finn taught me that freedom and love are not opposites. They are the same thing. We belong to each other, not by holding on, but by setting each other free. One evening, as a storm blew in from the mountains, Helen stood at her window and watched the trees dance in the wind. She felt the wildness in her bones, the call of something new and unknown. She was not the same woman she'd been before Finn. She was braver, softer, and more willing to risk joy. Helen understood now that the wild laughter she'd shared with Finn would never truly leave her. It echoed in her days, in the kindness of her neighbors, in the way she met the world with open hands instead of clenched fists. She had been transformed, not by taming a wild creature, but by learning to welcome wildness into her own life. As the snow fell and the night deepened, Helen whispered a silent thank you to Finn, to the wild, to the uncertain and beautiful future that still lay ahead. The journey was never really about keeping. It was always about learning, changing, and sharing what she'd discovered with anyone willing to listen. In the end, both she and Finn were set free, one to the woods and the unknown, the other to a life renewed by laughter, friendship, and the wisdom of letting go. Winter eventually loosened its grip on the pines, and the world softened once more. The air grew sweet with the promise of spring, sap rising in the trunks, green shoots nosing through the old leaves. Helen found herself opening the windows to let in the fresh, chilly breeze, her heart stirred by the familiar chorus of songbirds. Every change in the weather brought a new memory, a flash of Finn's wildness, the laughter and heartbreak and wonder that had filled her days with him. The routines of Helen's life had shifted, but not faded. Each morning, she poured a mug of coffee, bundled into her old sweater, and sat on the porch with Maggie, watching the woods for any sign of her wild friend. Sometimes, a fox trotted by in the early dawn, pausing to sniff the air before melting into the shadows. Other days, Helen spotted a bobcat's paw print near the garden, or found a blue jay feather tucked beneath her doormat. Each small discovery felt like a conversation, a reminder that she was still part of the larger, wilder world. Helen's connection to her neighbors deepened, too. When she walked into the corner store, people greeted her with warmth and genuine curiosity, often asking if there was any new news of Finn. The children who had once giggled and watched from behind the fence were now bold enough to bring her wildflowers or stories about animals they'd seen in their own yards. There was a new openness among the people of the valley, a sense of shared experience that went beyond fences and front doors. Sometimes Helen wondered if Finn's laughter hadn't somehow threaded its way into every home, every heart. She started telling her story, first over coffee with friends, then in a local newsletter, and finally online. Helen never expected the response. Letters from strangers, drawings from children, stories of wild creatures, and second chances from all over the country. People thanked her for her honesty, for her bravery in loving and letting go. Some wrote about their own wild friends, owls, stray dogs, wounded deer, and how those connections changed them. Others simply said her story made them feel less alone, more willing to open their hearts to the unexpected. Helen realized, as she shared, that her story was never really just about her and Finn. It was about risk and laughter, heartbreak and healing. It was about the ways we change when we allow the world in, even especially when it doesn't fit our plans. It was about seeing the wildness in ourselves and others and choosing not to be afraid of it. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky in fierce gold and lavender, Helen sat on her porch, a journal balanced on her knees. Maggie dozed beside her, and the woods beyond shimmered with possibility. Helen began to write, not just for herself, but for anyone who might need these words. Sometimes, the laughter we need most comes from where we least expect it. Sometimes, the wildest friendships teach us the deepest lessons. Finn didn't come to me for taming or comfort or even survival. He came as he was, wild, broken, beautiful. He reminded me that healing is a shared journey, that joy is often born from chaos, and that love, even for the wild, is always worth the risk. I don't know where Finn is now. I hope he's running through the pines, strong and free, or napping in a patch of sunlight somewhere deep in the woods. I hope he remembers the warmth of the fire, the taste of chicken scraps, the sound of laughter echoing through these walls. I know I'll always remember the lessons he brought to my doorstep: to let go, to trust, to open my heart no matter how much it hurts. Helen set down her pen and closed her eyes, listening to the gentle hush of evening. The world felt both wide and close, mysterious and kind. For the first time in her life, she was grateful for every scar, every loss, every lonely morning, because all of it had brought her to this wild and unexpected joy. As dusk deepened, Helen rose and stepped into the yard, letting the grass brush against her bare feet. She looked up at the stars winking through the pines and sent out a silent wish for all those, everywhere, who were still waiting for a wild friend to cross their path. Before heading inside, Helen turned back to the porch and spoke, as if Finn might be listening from the shadowy edge of the trees. "Thank you for finding me, wild boy. Thank you for teaching me how to laugh again." And to anyone else listening, to friends, neighbors, strangers, and anyone who'd ever felt alone, Helen offered her last lesson, her gentle invitation. If this story made you smile or brought back memories of your own wild encounters, I'd love for you to share your thoughts or your animal stories in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you'd like more tales of hope and wildness. Let's keep this circle of laughter and healing growing together. Because the world is full of wild friends, waiting just beyond the edge of everything. Helen stepped inside, Maggie at her heels, feeling at peace, not because the world was safe or certain, but because she had learned to greet it with an open heart. Outside, the wind stirred the pines, and just for a moment, Helen could almost hear wild laughter riding the evening breeze. The story of Finn and Helen, of wildness and healing, of love and letting go, would live on, not just in memories and stories, but in every heart brave enough to welcome a little wildness into their life.